I'll start by, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm joining you from today, and acknowledge that we're all joining from different lands across Australia. For over 60,000 years, the Gadigal people have practiced sustainable custodianship, taking only what was needed and sharing resources equitably, and maintaining balance between community needs and environmental preservation. And so, as we discuss consumer advocacy today, I think we can learn from these enduring principles of responsible stewardship and collective community needs and environmental preservation. And I pay my respect to elders past and present. Well, thank you for joining us for this webinar today. So I'm Michael Della Jacobo, Executive Manager of Advocacy and Policy at Energy Consumers Australia. So energy consumers are being asked to weigh in on technical but highly impactful issues like stranded gas assets and the financeability of new electricity transmission projects. And the way that these views are understood and incorporated by networks and regulators are really critical. And this report that we're talking about today has explored how those perspectives are being captured and where the gaps lie and what better engagement could look like for fairer outcomes. So we're joined today by the authors of this report, Helen and Kieran. After I introduce them, they'll speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So feel free to add any questions to the Q&A as we go, and you'll find the button at the bottom of your screen. So Helen Bartley is an independent qualified professional researcher and fellow of the Research Society and accredited statistician with an advanced certificate in engagement. She has been a member of the Australian Energy Regulators Consumer Challenge Panel since 2022 and has represented consumer interests as a member of the AER's Rate of Return Consumer Reference Group. She also sits on several electricity distribution network consumer advisory panels and has provided the AER with written and verbal advice on several gas access arrangement proposals throughout the NEM. And Kieran Donoghue is a qualified and experienced economist who works as an independent consumer representative and consultant in the energy sector. Kieran has consulted to organisations such as Energy Consumers Australia, the Energy Security Board, as well as industry participants and peak bodies. He has worked as a senior price control manager for the UK regulator Ofgem, general manager of policy for the Australian Energy Council, and is a member of AusNet's Consumer Reference Group. He was also a member of the AER's Rate of Return Consumer Reference Group. So thank you, Helen and Kieran, and over to you. I will switch to sharing your slides here, but otherwise keen to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, ECA, and welcome everybody. And thank you for taking the time out of your busy days so that we can share a few thoughts with you and hopefully get some interesting discussion happening. So, as Michael mentioned, I'm Helen Bartley and Kieran is my colleague. And before I get too far down the presentation, I would also like to acknowledge, next slide please, the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all work and the lands on which Energy Consumers Australia represents and advocates for energy consumers. And if you want to put in your chat the lands on which you're dialing in from today, please feel free to do so. We honour the customs and traditions and special relationship of those traditional custodians with the land and respect the elders of those nations past and present, and pay my respects to any First Nations people who may be joining us online today. So thank you very much. And the next acknowledgement that we'd like to have is to firstly take the opportunity to thank those consumer advocates, regulatory representatives, networks and others who so willingly gave their time and support for our project, enabling us to conduct interviews both formally and informally. So we really appreciate that opportunity. And we also acknowledge the financial support and Michael's specific support along the way with this project. So thank you, Energy Consumers Australia, for enabling this work to be undertaken. So the way we're going to structure it, I'm going to provide you with a bit of an overview of our project, flick to Kieran, who's going to provide you with some context of the regulatory context and some more technical context. And then we'll talk about some of what we've heard and wrap up with the conclusions and next steps before I hand over to Michael for any questions. So we thought rather than interrupting our presentation and falling behind, that if we could leave all questions to the end, but please pop them in the chat. Michael's going to moderate those questions. So yeah, we should have plenty of time for questions and discussion. But if you feel like your questions don't get answered, we welcome you getting in touch with us to raise any issues or just make comment if you like. So what did this project entail? So I guess a little bit of background to start with. How did the project come about? Michael's given a little bit of an overview of my background and Kieran's background, and I guess in the work that Kieran and I have shared over the years, as anyone who works in the energy sector and in the regulated energy sector does, you get talking about all sorts of technical and non-technical issues. And this just happened to be one of probably our coffee catch-up or lunchtime conversations that came about, that I'd been observing a lot of consumer engagement, seen lots of different approaches to this issue. We know the future of gas is uncertain, and that's creating a lot of challenge for both for networks, for regulators and for consumers as to how that uncertainty gets managed. And it's leaving, putting this elephant in the room that we call accelerated depreciation. And at the same time, we've got the electricity transmission network needing to be augmented rather quickly, and transmission networks seeking ways to finance the rapid growth of transmission assets. So Kieran and I had started talking a lot about this, and we've been talking about it'd be great to collaborate on a project. And we approached ECA late last year with a proposal that let's look at these issues in a little bit more depth and see if we can perhaps add a little bit more value across the sector to produce the better outcomes for consumers. So we probably started off with rather grandiose ambitions of doing a lot more than we could. And we really, at the end, decided we wanted to narrow focus and provide hopefully some really positive direction that would benefit all parties. So I hope that that's what we can present today. What else do I want to say? Probably nothing more on this slide at the moment, but if we could flick to the next one, please. So how did we approach this project? Well, we didn't want to go in blindly. We actually did lots of desk research, reread various regulatory proposals, regulatory guidance and determinations, consumer engagement reports and so on, to really try and get a handle on the evolution of engagement around the subjects of financeability and accelerated depreciation, to really understand how it all started, what decisions occurred as a result of different forms of engagement, and where there were pitfalls and where things seemed to be going really well. So we really hopefully have in our report developed a reasonable chronology of what has happened that might be useful. Apologies if we've missed out the 2025. One of the I guess pitfalls of this kind of work is it can always be updated. So we really sort of focused on up to 2024. And we also partly did that because we felt it was really important not to be conflicted by work that I'm involved in my consumer challenge panel role. So we didn't want to create any conflicts there. And secondly, while work is live and happening, we didn't want to throw any spanners in any work. So with the greatest of respect, if we haven't had a chat to you, or please don't take that as in terms of we didn't want to. We just tried to be a little bit prudent about the way we went with our work. So from the desk research, Kieran and I put our heads together, decided that we really needed to ensure a balance between perspectives of consumers, consumer representatives in particular, networks themselves, and the regulator. So we saw those as the three core stakeholder groups that really have an interest from various angles on these subjects. So between our contacts, between recommendations from others, we developed a group of 18 stakeholders and that represented, and through that we engaged or interviewed 26 different individuals. So those individuals had varying experiences from being regulatory decision makers, people within gas network distribution networks who are developing regulatory proposals, people that from an economic perspective, those people who are responsible for designing and delivering engagement, including engagement practitioners, and those people who might participate in from a consumer representative perspective or actually observe consumer engagement. So we really wanted to look at these whole issues quite holistically. We didn't just include representatives from the NEM. It's worth noting that we had also included representatives from Western Australia. What else do I want to say? We didn't offer incentives, so we really appreciate, I think, everybody who we approached was very happy to have a chat with us, whether that was over a coffee, real or virtual. So we did mix our interviews both face-to-face and online. We decided that we were going to report the feedback anonymously. It was really important for us, or for the people that we interviewed with. We wanted people to feel like they could speak candidly. They didn't have to, if they felt comfortable, toe their organisation's line, and they could just really talk about how they saw what they'd seen and what they'd heard. So anonymous feedback hopefully enabled some candid responses. And the key topics that we were interested in to ultimately fulfil the purpose of trying to achieve better outcomes, we thought it was really important to understand where people were at in terms of their own understandings of accelerated depreciation and financeability, first at that kind of more technical level, but then if you met someone down the street and they asked you, what is this? How would they explain those concepts in a more practical or a more friendly, over the pub discussion ways? We were then interested to look at perceptions of consumer engagement, both from the design and the delivery of that engagement, and then leading from all of that, where does the future lie? What were the pitfalls? What's working well, and how can we actually improve that engagement into the future? So we really wanted fluid discussion, and we found that that's exactly what happened. People with different interests focused on different aspects of the areas that we wanted to discuss. So that's really setting the scene. I'm going to hand over to Kieran, and then I'll come back and chat about some of the findings. So thank you.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks, Michael, for the introduction and for driving the slides. There's the next few slides are sort of quite content heavy, but I'm going to do my best to keep it relatively brief and note firstly that these matters are covered in more detail in the report, and I note someone's already asked for a link. Oh, and I think the link's already been added to the chat for those of you that haven't seen it yet. And also, I'm happy to take any questions on any of this if anyone wants me to go into more detail in this session. But just to sort of set the scene briefly from a regulatory perspective, I'm going to assume, sort of looking at most of the names on the chat, that you sort of have a basic understanding of the building block approach that is applied to regulated energy networks, both in Western Australia and in the NEM or Eastern Australia. But just to sort of briefly consider sort of where depreciation and therefore accelerated depreciation fits in. I think it's worth recording the reasons why we have an asset base and then annual depreciation for capital expenditure, rather than just a pay-as-you-go approach like OPEX, where all the CapEx cash flows are recoverable in 1 year. And I think there's two key reasons. One is intergenerational equity. So that's the principle that consumers in a given period should pay for the assets they are making use of, rather than imposing that cost either on past consumers or future consumers. And the second is, at least in a period of rising expenditure, such as we're seeing in transmission, concerns about affordability and bill shock. And I think also worth noting that the use of the RAB and a gradual return of expenditure via depreciation is actually the reason why the network has to finance its capex through a mixture of debt and equity. And this is why networks have to be able to recover a return on that financing capital, the cost of capital, or the WACC, as it's sometimes known. If we could go to the next slide, please. So there's two different regulatory contexts under consideration, but both relate to the ability to finance a regulated business. So one is the question of long-term financeability. So if the use of, say, a gas network declines over time, whether due to customer choices or policy decisions, then its assets are risk of being stranded, i.e. they may be unable to fully recover their capital due to low or no utilisation of the physical assets. The other is a question of short-term financeability. So when networks such as a transmission business needing to build new major projects faces a sharp rise in its capex, then it has a bigger financing challenge, but its revenue doesn't increase in proportion to its expenditure because it's recovering these costs over 50 years or more. Now, despite these being quite different challenges, the fact that they're both financeability issues means that they share a potential solution or mitigation. It's not necessarily a full solution, which is to accelerate the recovery of capital. And one way of doing that is to accelerate the rate of depreciation. So in the case of gas, the premise is that changing expectations about the future of the gas network has changed the useful life of the assets. And the energy rules, specifically Rule 89, Subclause 1, Subclause C, allows a change to the depreciation rate accordingly. By contrast, the rule that enables accelerated depreciation for transmission was only added last year. And to say that is less about a change in the life of the assets, and it's more about cash flows for financeability. Now, advancing network cash flows for whatever reason has implications for today's consumers or users of that network. That means they pay more sooner, and conversely, future consumers should pay less. And because regulators expect networks to inform or test proposals that impact consumers, one of the areas they can do that on is if they're looking to accelerate depreciation. And in particular, regulators value sound evidence of consumer preferences. If we go to the next slide. So this is really just a sort of a schematic just to remind us that accelerated depreciation is only one of many policy options. The other options may differ depending whether you're talking about gas network stranded assets or transmission financeability. And there's a fuller list of potential options in the paper for both cases. And in some cases, of course, a solution can't be applied right away. It might need to change the rules or something else, but it's still a potential policy option. It wasn't in scope of the project for us to opine which is the best approach, but the fact that there are options is relevant to the way that issues are presented to consumers. If we go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to take you very briefly, again, fuller description in the paper of the history of consumer engagement on accelerated depreciation. So interesting, the first attempt to engage customers on accelerated depreciation was AusNet's electricity transmission business in 2015. And at that time, it was due to a concern they had about potentially stranded assets, not rapid expansion. So more similar to the situation that gas networks find themselves in. It was acknowledged as a complex issue, and ultimately the AER rejected the stranded asset claim. Then in 2019, Gemina in New South Wales became the first gas network to seek and to engage customers on accelerated depreciation. They brought in an independent consultant to test consumer views, and then later on in the process, a UK academic to argue that the AER should accept clear consumer preferences unless there was a good reason not to. Consumer representatives were generally sceptical, not necessarily because they rejected the idea of accelerated depreciation, but that they saw it as part of a broader policy issue rather than just a simple question of consumers pay more now versus pay more later. And again, in this case, the AR did not accept that there was clear enough evidence of asset stranding to warrant a change in depreciation. In 2020, the proposals for accelerated depreciation came thick and fast. This was both in the East, so Evo Energy in the ACT, AGN South Australia business, APA Victorian transmission businesses, while over in the West, Dampier-Bunbury Pipeline also sought accelerated depreciation. Now, the AGN South Australia was actually quite different from all the others because it sought accelerated depreciation as an asset write-off due to a safety case-based replacement program, and didn't directly engage consumers on this proposal, but the AR actually accepted it. So in a sense, both the network and the AR treated this as more a sort of a technical decision rather than a consumer engagement area. All the other businesses had some accelerated depreciation allowed, but less than they asked for, and with fairly modest price implications, at least for small customers. Moving forward into the 2020s, sorry, I should mention at 2021, the AER, sort of realizing there was a bit of a pattern emerging, put out a regulatory guidance paper, and that was where it identified accelerated depreciation as, in general, it's the most likely tool that it would use or allow networks to use out of a range of options. Moving forward, the Victorian gas distribution businesses carried out a joint engagement approach, and most recently, Gemina Gas Networks has also carried out further engagement on its latest access arrangement. Now, in both those cases, there was continuing engagement, but also continued questioning of the specific terms of the engagement from consumer representatives and also from the consumer challenge panels that were observing these processes. And the AER has moved in all these cases to using a price path approach that limits the amount of accelerated depreciation that can be claimed with looking at it through an affordability lens. Now, the AER itself didn't test its price paths directly with consumers, but applied its regulatory adjustment. Meanwhile, over in the West, ATCO sought accelerated depreciation for its gas distribution network, even in the context of still forecasting customer growth, and the ERA allowed part of the claim. The ERA is not applying a price path in the same way that the AER is. Go to the next slide, please. Very different history for transmission. So the first integrated system plan in 2018 really established the basis for significant transmission expansion in a way that hadn't been seen for a couple of decades. And since then, there's been a range of approaches have been considered in order to address concerns about networks' ability to finance these major projects. Some of these have gone beyond the regulatory framework, such as the Commonwealth's Rewiring the Nation Fund, which offers concessional finance, and have also included cost of capital options, albeit ultimately not implemented, as well as financeability adjustments. And finally, the rules were changed in 2024 to allow a financeability adjustment in specific circumstances. The evaluation and decision process that the AER has to follow for this is very prescriptive, which doesn't leave an obvious space for consumer preferences to be accounted for. So that sort of brought us very quickly up to date, and I'm going to hand back to Helen to discuss the feedback from our stakeholder interviews.
Many thanks, Kieran. So just a reminder of what we were interested in first, which was really about understanding various stakeholders' understanding of accelerated depreciation and financeability on the basis that different stakeholder perspectives might actually, hopefully we would see some alignment. But I think that was a really important starting point for us. Then where consumer engagement fits in relation to those stakeholders in terms of their roles and how they might be involved in either the process and or use the outcomes in people's different roles. Then what do people get out of that engagement? What seemed to be working well? Where could improvements be made? And then that naturally leads into what we were hoping to achieve with our project. Well, what do people envisage given the current regulatory framework, I should say? Of course, if the regulatory framework were to change, future engagement possibilities could also look very different. But we are acknowledging that we are working within the current constraints. So next slide. Now we get to the interesting stuff. What did we learn? So just at a really high level to begin with, it's clear that the concepts of both accelerated depreciation and financeability are complex for consumers to understand. And one thing we really noticed is when you ask both right from the spectrum of informed consumer representatives to network operators to the regulator to explain their understanding, there's a really pretty consistent level of a consistent explanation around what these tools are meant to achieve and the language that was used. But then framing it slightly differently, well, how would you explain these concepts to consumers? So the pub test, we got very, very different explanations. And I think therein is the start of perhaps what is the challenge in terms of engaging with consumers on a concept that those of us who are relatively well informed get, but try turning the language around to engage more broadly is quite challenging. So that's the first thing that we learned. The second key message is that consumer engagement is typically narrowly focused. So what I mean there, from a network perspective, we appreciate that networks are working within a regulatory framework, and so therefore we'll develop an engagement approach that aligns with that framework and aligns with achieving the outcomes. And I'm not talking about the answers here, I'm talking about achieving an engagement process that will help inform the outcomes that will in turn lead to them developing their regulatory proposals that are hopefully in consumer interests. So the narrow focus, which we'll come back to a little bit later, is a really important and interesting consideration. Leading back to that first point that I made, the consumer understanding of concepts is questionable. So both in terms of we've got different explanations of what these terms mean, but secondly, we have not found a lot of evidence of strong testing and understanding of consumer understanding of the concepts and how consumers can provide feedback on what their preferences are if they're not really understanding or we're not comfortable that they understand what's being asked of them, I think is a really challenging question. That's probably a researcher's question as much as anything in terms of testing and validating understanding of concepts. So that really means that informed consumer advocates are better placed to engage deeply, and I don't think that will come as any surprise to anybody. And the last one is that clearly we set out to try and look at both financeability and accelerated depreciation, but as Kieran has, I think, made really clear, that financeability is an emerging topic. The engagement opportunities, at least at this point in time, are relatively limited, both by the rules and by the fact that there's not been a lot of engagement to date to allow evolution of thinking and testing of thinking. So they're the headlines, and just to focus on a few key things that I think are worth elaborating on, we could go to the next slide, please. So difficult to explain accelerated depreciation to end consumers and no agreement on how to explain it to consumers. So big challenge here. What are we actually asking consumers? And when the regulator makes a decision for one network's regulatory proposal or access arrangement, is that decision based on the same type of understanding among one lot of consumers giving their preferences to the next? So there's some real challenges, I think, in terms of both the collection of information and the interpretation of it, and thirdly, how it is actually used to inform or contribute to regulatory decisions. Financeability, as we keep coming back to, emerging topic, and we really, there's no evidence that really suggests that consumer engagement has been tested much beyond informing consumers that a network is going to apply for a financeability arrangement to support its investments. Next slide, please. So this constrained context for engagement, I think, is a really interesting one. And those of you who might be familiar with the AER's decision on the Gemina gas access, most recent Gemina gas access arrangement, might also, some of this might resonate. But as I've said, networks engage within the regulatory framework and the context that's available to them. Common theme is intergenerational equity arguments are presented to consumers. So is it fair for the next generation to pay for what we use today? Who should pay? Then linked to that, we hear statements such as, well, if you pay more now, you can save later, but we haven't seen a lot of evidence that those savings are quantified for consumers. We also sense that, from several perspectives, that engagement is commonly focused on establishing support for certain dollar amounts. So commonly you'll see consumers presented with a finite choice of options, big dollars, middle dollars and low dollars, and what would they prefer to be paying or having added to their bill today. And linking back, you could almost present this diagram or this slide as a circular diagram. There's no option to consider alternatives to recover the cost of stranded assets. So commonly engagement makes the assumption that consumers will and should pay, and that goes back to engaging within the regulatory framework, arguably. But maybe some richer engagement is, what do consumers actually think as to who should pay and how these potentially stranded assets should be funded. Interestingly, in some more recent engagement that I have seen, consumers have actually raised this issue proactively. So it is starting to emerge, particularly in networks that do have a finite lifespan. Next slide, please. So meaningful engagement. I think this is where we are at the point in time where my mind and you know, my advice and my peers' advice from CCP has certainly been published, that you're welcome to read my personal viewpoint. But I think as a CCP member, but more broadly, we certainly sense from the engagement that we had in this project that consumer understanding has not been adequately tested. We see limited evidence that consumers understand the bill implications of network tariff increases. And there's a term which, if you are in the research world, you may be familiar with, called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is really about people overestimating their understanding of a topic. And it's a bit like if you're in a crowd and you're asked, do you understand? It's a bit embarrassing to say, no, I don't. So people will tend, for example, to go along with, oh, yes, well, everyone else understood. I must be the klutz that says I don't understand. So, okay, I'll just pretend I understand. But importantly, it's questionable whether just by asking people, do you understand, is adequate testing. And I often think about the analogy of my children when they went to school and would have to learn how to solve a maths problem, or maybe doing a history assignment, and they would have to write in their own words how they understood to establish their understanding. So I think, you know, in the research world, we're quite rudimentary in the way we assume and test consumer understanding of concepts. So it's good food for thought. And I've just come out of the Research Society conference yesterday and thinking there's probably a really good paper for our industry there. And the other issue alongside that is the finite options that are presented to customers, which is called Piggy in the Middle. And I was so rapt that it had a name that I could actually put in a cute picture into the presentation. So what we're commonly seeing are customers presented with 3 or 5 maybe dollar amounts, or even if it's presented, even if an amount's presented on a continuum, their response is landing where you would think it would land, in the middle of that distribution. And there's certainly rare that we would see any option presented for no accelerated depreciation. So hence the questions remain, is the engagement meaningful? Next slide, please. And I think I'm back to no, I'm not quite back to Kieran yet. So the considerations for future engagement within the current regulatory context. We asked the question as to who should engage. And I think a clear message came from across stakeholders that diversity is really important. And it's a basic principle in the research world that you want to capture diversity of perspectives, because that is really about capturing variability in the data and getting a better estimate of the parameter that you're trying to measure. So definitely consumers, but the processes need to be more robust and not technical. Obviously, a major challenge. There's a genuine role for consumer advocates and those who we might call informed consumer advocates, who are better placed to engage perhaps in a more technical level on these proposals. We think regulators need to be involved. They, as regulators, need to understand the broader issues such as consumer perspectives on fairness and equity so that they can make better regulatory decisions. Obviously, the networks, and by the way, this list is in no particular order, so if you think you're down the bottom, it doesn't mean you're less important, and consumer organisations more broadly. The big one for us, which was suggested by a number of stakeholders, at the moment, we're seeing predominantly network consultants design and perhaps lead the engagement, sometimes with input from their 3-letter acronym consumer panels, which is great. But we think there's a real role to take a step back even before then and develop co-design and co-delivery processes between all of those stakeholder groups, because the big challenge, as I see it from a consumer representative perspective at the moment, is trust and confidence in the processes. So if the process and the development is really transparent and involves all of those parties that have got a vested interest at the outset, then I think better outcomes can be produced. And of course, the regulator is the decision maker, whether that's the AER or the counterparts in WA. Obviously, we need to give consideration for any guidance that exists, whether that's lower G or capital G. Now I think I'm handing back to Kieran.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. I'll just quickly wrap up with the conclusions and recommendations from the report. Or I would say Helen, I think, has sort of covered off a number of these. But I might just emphasise a couple of things. I think one is that engagement needs to consider sort of the full range of consumer perspectives on fairness and equity. And I think that includes, at least for context, to find out to what extent consumers think governments have a role, and even if they consider network shareholders should have some exposure to stranding risks. And I think even if a reset process can't in itself deliver government support, that's still useful information to get. So it's important to validate consumer understanding, and having talked about some ways to do that. And I think another element of that could be to sort of make sure that you're sort of testing their reaction to the bill impact of any apparent preferences around accelerated depreciation. Also, I think there's a fair amount of regulatory precedent out there now, and I think networks should think about when they're engaging to confine the range of any options proposed to what will be plausibly acceptable to the regulator, and to always test a zero option, even if they consider that they need to ask for a positive amount. I think in the case of electricity transmission financeability, so it's a bit of a different context. The focus probably is on an informed level of a consult, which aids transparency and builds trust. And one of the things that came out of our interviews and discussions was that there doesn't seem to be a good holistic overview of the impact of all the different processes that are driving transmission investment, from the BAU resets to regulatory investment tests to roadmap and other jurisdictional programs. And there'd be real value both in that holistic view being taken and in consumers being engaged on the impacts, both to the network and its ability to finance itself, and also on them as consumers. And I think that's one very useful way for them to build an understanding with consumers about the purpose of a financeability adjustment and why a transmission business considers it needs to ask for it. And look, obviously keen to leave a bit of time for some questions. So now I'll just say thanks very much for your time. There are contact details if anyone wants to follow up, and I'll hand back to Michael to moderate the questions and discussions.
Thank you very much, Helen and Kieran. That was a great overview, I think. And we've got some questions coming up in the Q&A box there. So please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and add any questions if you'd like. I'll stop sharing these slides. We've got a link to the report in the chat there. So if you want to go and look at it in more detail, you can. But I'll kick us off with the first question, wondering if the study has found any link between evidence of consumers' preferences and the AER's ultimate decision-making on accelerated depreciation.
Well, I'll get a first crack at that. I mean, I think it's clear that the AER certainly, and I think the ERA as well, see their role as exercising regulatory judgment, and I think they're seeing these issues as being quite nuanced and complex. And so I think that it's likely that consumer preferences are being taken into account, but this is not a negotiated settlement. So that doesn't mean that, if a network presents some, results of some engagement that says the majority of consumers chose X million dollars as their preferred option, that the regulator does or should just wave it through. I mean, I think there may be something for the regulators to think about how they present, how they took account of consumer preferences as collected by the network, because I would say from the ones I read, it wasn't always especially evident in the sort of their discussion of the final decision, but that's probably more a presentational thing for regulators to consider rather than an indication that they didn't take account of this feedback.
I might add to Kieran's response, and I'm going to put my Consumer Challenge panel hat on. And so in our written advice to the AER on New South Wales gas access arrangement, we made some comment there, particularly in their original access arrangement proposal around concerns about the engagement. And as a result of that, that was, I think, reflected fairly well in their draft decision, and JGN, to their credit, went out and further engaged with customers to try and validate what they heard. I'm not going to say that was ideal or not, but as a result of that event, subsequently, when we wrote our final advice to the AER after JGN submitted its revised access arrangement proposal, we made some further comment, and we note in that the depreciation appendix to that determination that the AER has provided some key points or key elements of guidance for future networks to consider in future engagements. So I think increasingly, perhaps, we're seeing, I wouldn't put a dollar amount to say A has led to B, but I think in terms of the issues and ensuring preferences are understood, consumers are having a voice, at least around approaches. I guess what would be really interesting is if there was strong evidence that consumers were prepared to have a massive amount of accelerated depreciation included, would that be approved or not? And I think that's when, as Kieran said, the regulatory judgment also needs to play a part.
Yeah, thanks for that, folks. And another question here, would love to hear how you did explain or accelerated depreciation to consumers, or I guess what works, what explanation works best, do you think?
I might take the lead on that one, if I may, Michael. Number one, I think it's fair to say in this work, it was neither Kieran nor I that explained acceleration depreciation to consumers. That's not what we set out to do. We were interested to know how networks or their engagement partners were explaining accelerated depreciation to consumers. And I think that what we've seen is an evolution there. We've seen lots of scenario testing around mortgages, for example, aligning accelerated depreciation to paying off a mortgage faster or slower. We've seen scenarios around establishment of the demise of a cafe that has a coffee business, and the coffee machines, coffee becomes illegal. I'm paraphrasing, so if I've got the scenario a little bit wrong, apologies, but essentially coffee becomes illegal, and so therefore, and it's going to become illegal in 5 years, and I've got to get rid of my coffee machines. How do I do that? So we've seen a lot of scenarios playing out, and I think so that's number one. There's no specific or consistent way, and I think this is where the challenge arises. But for me, I would almost also say, regardless of the scenario that's played out, it's about ensuring that what consumers are seeing and hearing, depending on the form of engagement, aligns with what accelerated depreciation or financeability are intended to do and what that actually means for customers' bills. So making sure that consumers understand that.
I think I'd also add that, I mean, when you're trying to explain sort of complex abstract topics to people, then analogies are useful, but we should always, the mortgage one was one that came up probably more often than the most, but we should remember they are just analogies, and there's always some way in which they are not perfectly representative of the particular situation, which doesn't mean they are pointless or useless, but just, you need to just bear that in mind when you're trying to use these kinds of analogies as simple ways to illustrate the issue.
Yeah, that sort of reminds me of the adage that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And I feel maybe the same, you could say the same for analogies as well. There are a few questions here that sort of around this same theme of whose role should it be to do consumer engagement? Given that what's the role and value of networks in doing their own engagement, given it's often their engagement is not trusted by many consumer advocates, or what's the value in doing more national level or consistent consumer engagement rather than having networks do things in different ways? So maybe I'll summarize that into whose role is it to do consumer engagement, and maybe what room for improvements are there in roles and responsibilities?
I think that point, I think if I was a network operator, I'd be asking exactly the same question. So that's the first thing. I would feel frustrated. And I think jumping really to one of our conclusions, I think we all have a shared responsibility. How do we develop trust? What's trust about? Trust is about transparency, good engagement. How can we get some of those, how can we give lift to some of those principles? And I think it goes back to, the network says we want to co-design this with the regulator, with consumer representatives, and we want to ensure that if everyone has ownership in the first instance, that has to produce a better outcome, as opposed to a network going it alone, and then you start to get the skepticism that we sometimes observe. So I think that it's a shared role. I'm not sure what that means about funding. That's a different question, but at least in terms of the principles, to have everybody work, the stakeholders who are interested co-designing and working together to produce better outcomes that everyone's got a vested interest in has to be a better process. So it's probably an ideal. And maybe just picking up on Tim's one, I think this idea of a national panel, I'm not so sure that I entirely agree. I think there are a lot of jurisdictional issues, and I think a national panel has a risk of losing variability and losing the ability to nuance to different jurisdictions. So anyway, Kieran might have a different view.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I understand that, I could see the idea of a national panel as a way of sort of stepping back from the specific interests of an individual network or other parties. But I think, because different jurisdictions are sort of driving the transition harder than others, I think there's just too much sort of network specific factors to take into account to sort of fully step back and try and do a sort of a one size fits all approach. But I mean, I think if parties other than networks had the resources, I think it would be really interesting to see other parties go out and do their own version of trying to get this information, and that would add to the overall evidence base.
If I could maybe just challenge that a little bit, if would there be value in having more standardized approaches to consumer engagement across different jurisdictions, if not having a national panel per se?
I mean, possibly, or at least I think, noting that, ERA and AER are different institutions. So, I mean, you might need sort of different approaches in the West and the East, even if they're in gas, at least notionally often applying the same rules. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly potentially scope for the regulators to, now we've been through a few iterations of this, to offer more detailed guidance, particularly to sort of signal what kind of evidence they consider more useful or compelling than other types of evidence. And I think there's, you could even broaden that out and say doesn't just apply to this particular issue of accelerated depreciation. I mean, we've had, better resets has been out for several years now. I'm not sure exactly how long. So, it may be timely for a broader update. And I don't think the ERA has an equivalent document to better reset. So that may be, an interesting option for them to pursue to sort of build out a bit more what their expectations are of the networks they regulate in terms of consumer engagement.
I think, Michael, the other, I think in terms of standardising, I would draw on principles of good engagement, so IAP2, as well as good research practice around sampling, question design, test and validate. So I think that, to me, is where consistency is needed. And I think that points really nicely to Kieran's point about the Better Resets handbook. And I don't think you want to have a one-size-fits-all, because I think that then pays lip service to the diversity of consumers and doesn't allow you to engage appropriately for different consumer groups and different needs. So, but I do think the principles that should underpin good engagement and good research need to come to the fore. And that's where I would be looking for consistency.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. I think maybe we'll have time for one or two more questions. So do either of you have any thoughts on whether only credible options should be presented to consumers?
I actually don't. I was probably slightly disagree with Kieran there, because, and it depends on A, what is a credible option, and B, I think as a consumer, from a consumer perspective, regardless of the regulatory framework, should we be constraining consumer views in a regulatory context? I'm not so sure. I think consumers have a right, and there's a lot of asymmetry anyway. I think it's good that we can say that consumers maybe have the right to say, actually, this is not the realm of the network. Consumers to pick up the tab. This should be a policy issue. Bad luck network that you chose to invest, you foot the bill. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying maybe consumers. I think if consumers can have those views, even if they're not, and articulate them, even if they're not realistic, I think that is really a really healthy outcome. It doesn't mean that if you do need to get, so that might be the starting point. So you've got the framing then to know that when consumers accept the midpoint, actually they're accepting a midpoint in the context of we don't have a choice. So I think we need to really understand what consumers genuinely think and feel before we constrain their thinking. You might agree now, Kieran.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. So I think I'd contrast between the general point about, yes, asking open questions of consumers that sort of, that might draw out what they think is the best solution, which may include something that's not necessarily on the table in a specific access arrangement or reset, versus if you're canvassing options that do lie firmly within the reset, like specific amounts of accelerated depreciation, then I would say it's still worth thinking about, what you think is, what you as a network think your regulator is realistically going to accept, given we have a fair amount of precedent to draw
on. I've got a response here from Tim about that last question of a national. I'll just leave this as a comment for the audience to think about. But Tim was saying he was not thinking of a national only panel, but more as a place of sharing to get some broad community benefits and common policies sorted. So I'll make that a comment. If you have a quick answer for this one, interested to hear your thoughts, maybe 30 seconds from each of you. Interesting to call this an emerging topic, given the history of consultation on it that you presented earlier. And there was surprise at how unemergent the topic turned out to be. How long can we call it emerging rather than simply a topic that hasn't been consulted on well? If you have any quick thoughts on that, and then we might wrap up.
Well, I think what we're trying to be about in this report is about how to do things better rather than judging whether things have been done well or badly. So, it's not intended as criticism of past practice. It's more, here's some ideas about how to do things better. And I think, whether or not you want to consider it an emerging issue or not, it is an issue. I think it's continuing to grow in materiality in both the gas network and electricity transmission context. So perhaps it's not that it's an emerging issue. It's more that the materiality of the issue and therefore the potential impact on consumers is growing.
And I was also going to thinking, I agree with Kieran too, and would also consider the concept of emerging, the idea of emerging in terms of emergence of processes and ways of thinking about this problem. I think it's back to you, Michael.
Lost my unmute button. Well, thank you for joining us, everyone. I failed to get this on full screen, but hopefully you can see some QR codes there to download a copy of the report if that's easier for you. Sign up for our newsletter and visit our website. Thank you very much, Helen and Kieran, for the work in this report and for taking the time today to give an outline of the work and answer some questions. A lot of extra questions in the chat that we didn't get to, so would encourage you to reach out to Helen and Kieran if you have any other questions that you want to get addressed. But thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you to both of you for joining us to share your thoughts.
Thanks,
everyone.
Thank you.